Talk to Sir Graham Brady. He's chairman of the 1922 Backbench Committee of Conservative MPs and is also a member of the COVID recovery group, calling for an easing of lockdown measures sooner rather than later. Good morning to you, Sir Graham.
Good morning, Julie.
Well, we're on this big stretch of the roadmap, and stage three, step three, is pretty much, one of the biggest. We're going to see so many different things we are now allowed to do in terms of rule of six indoors, socialising indoors, staying overnight at a family member's home, going to a hotel, going back to travelling abroad, cinemas, theatres, museums reopening, pubs, restaurants, bars, all cafes, all able to open indoors for the first time, although with social distancing. Children no longer wearing masks in the classroom or at school at all. Lots of this is to be welcomed. And yet, there's this real sort of doom and gloom about this Indian variant, where we're told we should act with caution by the Prime Minister. And we're told also by many members of SAGE that actually this is going to lead to a huge surge in cases. One model suggesting 10,000 people a day going to need hospitalisation. What do you make of this?
Well, you could always get excited, couldn't you, Julia? But when you stop to think about it, what's actually happening today is that something which last September SAGE said there was only very weak evidence for, if any, i.e. closing indoor hospitality, is going to be reversed. So we're seeing various measures that were introduced as a belt and braces, safety first approach, just in case they had any positive effect, coming to an end. Yeah. So we can go to a pub indoors, go to a restaurant indoors. SAGE said that wasn't going to make any difference when they were closed, and probably hasn't made any difference. Yeah. But it's a good thing we can do it again. The ban on leaving the country. I still have to pinch myself. I'm astonished that we ever had a situation where people were banned by law from leaving the United Kingdom. You said the ban on having holidays abroad. Actually, is much more than that. Yeah. Millions of British people who have family living overseas, who haven't been able to see their nearest and dearest for a year or more in many cases, that is coming to end. It's a positive thing, but we do need to remind ourselves these are basic liberties. Yeah. That we should never have been deprived.
But also people being grateful. I've said this, I remember on April the 12th as well, this idea that we should, thank you ever so much for allowing me to, to go about my normal business, to see my loved ones, to go back to work or whatever. I mean, it is absolutely outrageous that these things have been taken away from us. And the really, really scary thing is that the vast majority of people have welcomed this, according to the polls. Now, vast majority of people are obeying the laws because I think, we're good citizens. We try and do the right thing. People are very wary of breaking the law, and quite rightly. But there's no doubt at all, and certainly in terms of people meeting indoors, with a rule of six or two households, we're told, or 30 outdoors, and hugging people. Let's be honest. Huge numbers of people, probably millions of people in this country, will have been breaking that rule all along, but in a very cautious, sensible way, where they've gone, well, you've had 2 jabs, I've had 2 jabs, or I've already had COVID, or you've already had COVID, or we're going to be hugging outdoors or with the window open. People have been taking those sort of precautions and being very sensible all the way along, haven't they? And now suddenly it's going to be made legal. Do you think there will be, as many of these experts, in inverted commas, have predicted, because a lot of the people who are experts apparently are just behavioural scientists rather than epidemiologists and virologists, that we are going to see this surge in cases, this Warwick model that the government has looked at, predicting 10,000 people needing to be hospitalised a day in July because of the Indian variant. This is the latest spanner in the works for us getting our freedom back. Do you trust that these experts have got it right?
Well, nearly 2 months ago, when we allowed children to go back to school, the same experts were saying there was going to be a massive spike in cases then. Yeah. In fact, children went back to school. It made no difference whatsoever. There was no evidence of a serious increase in cases in schools and no increase in infections in the community as a result of it. So I think we certainly should take these predictions with a very large pinch of salt. All of the evidence that we're seeing is that the vaccines that have been administered so effectively in the United Kingdom actually have a very good level of efficacy in dealing with all of the known variants so far, including the so-called Indian variant. So if we just, again, take a step back and think about the way all of this started, the way the restrictions were introduced, the justification for the restrictions, at the time, the justification was that we were worried about the people who are likely to get seriously ill and perhaps have to go to hospital with COVID, the danger that the NHS could be overwhelmed because of COVID cases. And we have to remind ourselves it is principally people who are quite elderly or have another serious medical condition who are likely to be that seriously affected by COVID. And then we just have to remind ourselves that almost all of those people are now fully vaccinated. I think today we're starting to invite people over the age of 35 to go for a COVID vaccine. And when you bear in mind that we're in that age group, that there is virtually no risk of serious illness. I know there have been a few outlying cases, but in terms of the population as a whole and the dangers of very high levels of illness and the dangers that large numbers of people will be going to hospital and serious numbers of people dying with this condition, that is very strongly age-related. And the older population has been vaccinated and the vaccine works.
I mean, this is the thing. The thing I find most frustrating is that the only people who don't trust the vaccine working seem to be the scientists who are telling us to get the vaccine and the government ministers. 20 million people have had those 2 doses. That's as much protection as people are going to have. There isn't going to be any more protection. Maybe in the future for variants, I mean, they may need to have boosters. That maybe not now. No one who's had one now needs to have a booster right now. This is as good as it gets. And if we're not going to come out now, we're never going to come out. And that is the really big fear, is that every time we get close to more freedom, we have a bunch of scientists coming out and saying, oh, I wouldn't do that. Again and again and again, their predictions way back from last February and March have proven to be wrong. Every single time their predictions, their computer models are proven to be wrong by a huge factor. And yet they're still being listened to. This latest report that went to the SAGE meeting, 89, 39 scientific experts attended. They rubber stamped this report. And this report suggests, say, hospitalisation at 10,000 per day in July. The number of people who would need to be affected, the lack of effectiveness of the vaccine on the variant, when there is no evidence whatsoever yet that the Indian variant isn't covered by the vaccine, and plenty of evidence that it is. So let's just look at what we're dealing with. Their assumptions are so ridiculous and unrealistic based on the empirical data we have. It is. I mean, frankly, I would consider it to be a sackable offence from their job. Let alone you weren't advising the government's SAGE committee for them to put this out there. Again and again, we see this. The 4,000 deaths a day. Remember, we had predicted from before Christmas. Why is the government still listening to these people? And isn't part of the problem that the government has created a monster that it can't control, and that they outsource their decision making to the scientists, the science, capital T, capital S, and now they can't take it back, and now the government can't do anything without the scientists saying it's okay. We seem to have elected a bunch of behavioural scientists and data modelers as our rulers, and we can't get rid of them.
Well, let's hope we've seen a change, a move away from that situation, Julia. What we're now seeing is a significant reopening going on. It's in line with the earlier advice from SAGE, as I mentioned earlier. And we've got ministers saying, well, we've got this freedom, we've got this opening up, lifting of restrictions, exercise some common sense. Now, as long as that isn't use your common sense, and if you don't use your common sense, we're going to step in and behave like grown-ups on your behalf again, then that's a great thing. We have to look at the fact that across the world there are examples, very few sadly, of places where people were asked to use their common sense throughout this crisis. Sweden is the obvious example, which has had ups and downs, but now we're at the point we are. We can see it's got a better record than the United Kingdom and many other places have, with no actual lockdown, just with voluntary restrictions and very few legal restrictions, I think, in place. You can look at different American states, the obvious contrast between California, which locked down and had very heavy restrictions, and Florida with an older population, which didn't lock down and had very few restrictions. And Florida's record on this is stronger than California's. So, I think we just need now, all of us, to insist this is for us as individuals to make our own decisions, to balance risk ourselves. It's not just that people generally want to obey the law. I think it's much more than that. People want to behave in a reasonable way. Nobody wants to be responsible for infecting an elderly relative or whoever else who may suffer serious illness as a result of it. But people, as you said, have been making their own judgments, even with these laws in place, where they use a little bit of their own knowledge and their own common sense to try to make sure they behave in a way which is reasonable and safe. And if we just continue in that way, then I think this will be fine.
Absolutely agree with you. Sir Graham Brady there, the member of the COVID recovery group at True Backbench